I would say that any corporate executive who is involved in international commerce or international investment nowadays needs to be informed about political risk.
Welcome to Baker's Dozen, a podcast series about geopolitics from Stratfor, a RANE company. I'm your host, Roger Baker. Geopolitics is a term that's often misunderstood and misused. In the media, anything seen as disruptive between two countries is called geopolitical tension. In academia, there are ongoing debates over whether geopolitics is a tool of power and oppression or something that explains state behavior. Geopolitics as an idea, though, is seeing a rapid resurgence, particularly as US-China great power competition is on the rise. Over the last few episodes, we've taken a look at key countries and regions through a geopolitical lens. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Len Hochberg, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the U.S. coordinator of the Mackinder Forum, to talk a little bit about geopolitics, why it's useful to add a geopolitical perspective to your toolkit. Len, thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Len, in your background, you were one of the founders of the Center for Geopolitical Studies, which was one of the predecessors of Stratfor, and actually one of the founders of the early form of Stratfor. You're also, from more than 20 years ago now, one of the founders of the Mackinder Forum. And both of these have focused very heavily on geopolitics. Why and how did you get into this geopolitical field in the first place?
I think it began when I was growing up. My father was a member of the Merchant Marine, and for many years he would travel the world, visiting places like Russia, India, Latin America, Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and many other places as well. And he'd come home with these stories about other countries, other peoples, other places. And I think that that awakened my appreciation of the fact that the world was a much larger place than the locality in which I grew up. I also had the opportunity while growing up to visit a number of seaports. And when I was visiting the seaports, it occurred to me that there were very different places than typical cities. You'd drive up to a dock, you'd see the stevedores offloading the ships. They'd be using forklifts to bring goods onto land and over to the warehouses from which the goods were dispersed across the country to retail establishments. That vision of bringing goods from overseas to the United States and also shipping them out was something that alerted me to the fact that seaports were windows to the world, especially windows economically to the world. And so I came to appreciate the fact that it was the seaport that was the place where the nation state interacted geoeconomically with the wider world. Later, much later, in graduate school, I had a desire to study comparative history. I was working in political science, and I wanted to be able to extend the thinking of political science into earlier periods, well earlier than, say, the aftermath of World War II. And to do that, I came to the conclusion that one of the ways to proceed was to ask around in the sociology department and in other departments to find out if anyone was doing comparative history. And I was very lucky at Cornell to discover that Edward Fox, who had written History and Geographic Perspective, was teaching in the history department. And he had developed a theory of European history that was based on a massive geographic fact that what occurred along the coastlines and the navigable rivers of Western Europe was fundamentally different than what occurred inland, and that two societies had grown up in various states in their territories, and that these two societies, one that was maritime and commercial, and another that was territorial and administrative, would occasionally engage in contests for power over what kind of regime would be installed in these various nation states. That insight gave me an opportunity to begin to do comparative historical work and to incorporate an early interest in geography into my studies in graduate school and ever since.
So it's interesting, two things that seem to come up there that are somewhat connected and somewhat opposed to each other. One is the recognition of the differences of places, that there are lots of differences around the world, and that idea is sort of exciting. And the other is the concept of connections. What are the connections or nodes in the way in which these places seem to come together or interact with one another?
Yes, that's exactly so. It seems to me that one issue in geography is the diversity of places and the realization that what is close to one another, what is proximate, ought to be similar. And because when geographers look at places, they also look at regions and similarities. But of course, there are connections among the places that sometimes lead to differentiation, spatial differentiation, it's sometimes called. And one way to approach that was pioneered by another one of the people I encountered over the years, a professor who taught at Stanford, a man named G. William Skinner, who developed a theory of regional systems analysis in order to understand the differentiation of space in agrarian systems, notably for China, prior to industrialization. And what Skinner was able to show was that the river valleys of Chinese regions defined by watersheds were fundamentally different than the upcountry areas of those watersheds. And so changes occurred as you moved upcountry, and the villages and market towns tended to become more isolated, whereas as you moved down toward the base of the river valley, there were more dense sets of connections in terms of administration and movement of goods and peoples. And so he built a series of models based upon regional systems analysis and began to apply those models not only to China, but also to Japan and France. And I was at Stanford at the time when he was doing some of that work, and team taught courses with him when I was in sociology at Stanford and when he was teaching anthropology there as well.
Clearly, there's the two pieces. There's the geographic component, and there's the relationship of the geographic component to people. And I guess at its most simplest, that is geopolitics, right? This the place and the polit. How would you define geopolitics, or how should we help people better understand geopolitics so they can start thinking through that geopolitical lens?
Well, I think that your initial comment is exactly correct, that geopolitics is an overused phrase, and it can be heard in the lecture hall and on television, and it's used as a very loose synonym for international strategic rivalry. However, there are more specific definitions of geopolitics, and I believe that at its root, classical geopolitics is the study of interstate conflict in geographic perspective. We know that states seek to create a favorable environment for the projection of military force, for the projection of political influence, cultural values, economic opportunity. And geopolitics then focuses on alliances, access to strategic goods that are essential for survival and during wartime. Also, it focuses on the concentrations, the geographic locations, and the loyalties of ethnic groups. And finally, perhaps it also tends to examine the location of natural and artificial barriers and carriers for the movement of weapons, materiel, and armed forces during wartime. So geopolitics has several components. One of them is geostrategy, that is, the interaction of geography and military affairs. It also tends to encompass or be concerned with geoeconomics, that is, the use of economic policy to secure geopolitical ends. And it's concerned with the social geography of states, that is, the presence of ethnic groups as minorities and whether they are discontented or not, and how that might facilitate the political influence by an adversary. All of these are the various components of geopolitics. I think that one of the great strengths of geopolitics is its interdisciplinary focus. When students are taking courses in many of the social sciences, the emphasis tends to be on analysis, and that's perfectly appropriate. In geopolitics, there's another emphasis, and that's on integration and synthesis of various bodies of knowledge in order to get a ever more complete picture of the nature of international rivalry and conflict, the causes, the course of such conflicts, and their consequences. I think that this is a absolutely critical feature of geopolitics. That is, its effort at integrating distinctive bodies of knowledge into a more coherent whole. It's as if one is trying to put together a very complicated puzzle, each piece of which is a different fact or a different piece of a theory into a picture, that the picture itself is evolving over time. And you want to be able to see the picture and see how it changes. And that is one of the goals of being able to integrate knowledge in this fashion.
The idea of synthesis, I note clearly goes back to Alfred Mackinder, who didn't really use the term geopolitics. He preferred to refer to himself as a geographer, but emphasized that there needed to be a space in academia, particularly as knowledge increases and there's more and more specialization, that there needed to be a place for this synthetic assessment, this pulling and teasing together of each of those other broad pieces. And we talk about it here a lot as you integrate geography, politics, economics, security, society, history, and technology, and look at how each of those interact and play with one another to ultimately create a cohesive whole. It's sort of a tapestry approach to understand the world and tease it apart. And it brings an interesting set of disciplines, because on the one hand, you need to know where and how to find and assess those discrete pieces of information and discrete fields, but you also need that big picture top-down look to start synthesizing it and weaving it all together.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right about that it's necessary to both have a sense of ground truth and a perspective from afar, and simultaneously to be able to do those two things. after years of attempting it, I have to say it isn't easy, but it's extraordinarily worthwhile. The attempt is extraordinarily worthwhile. Mackinder himself in 1919 wrote a book called Democratic Ideals and Reality. And what he tried to do was to write a history of the geostrategies of land based and maritime powers and how they interacted with one another since the ancient Mediterranean through World War One. And in many ways, the book is an effort also to describe what would likely be the outcome of World War One at Versailles, at the peace negotiations. The book is a remarkable historical, geographic, and national security synthesis that takes into account economics and the transformation of technologies. The most important, of course, being the technologies of transportation and communication, because those are the technologies that when it comes right down to it, those are the technologies that alter the significance of place as strategic entities. The building of railroads, Mackinder understood from his early essay on the geographic pivot. The building of railways, most notably the Trans-Siberian Railway, altered the face of Eurasia, creating the possibility of what he called a Eurasian heartland, an area that essentially was Siberia and some additional significant territories that could, if united, pose an enormous threat to maritime power. And it was that insight that has motivated policymakers in maritime powers in Great Britain and in the United States to realize that through World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, that Eurasia must not be unified. It must remain fragmented in order for maritime power to remain significant and vital, and in order for it to protect the sea lanes. So Mackinder, for whom we named the Mackinder Forum, his intellectual contribution stands astride much of the policy making, formulation, and implementation when it comes to national security for maritime powers through the 20th century and into the 21st century.
As we look at geopolitics as a field or as a way of thinking, a way of studying, a way of observing, clearly, as you've laid out several times, it has tremendous value in national security and strategic security constructs. In what other ways or in what other fields can it be helpful? I would argue that taking that viewpoint helps you whether you're in global economics, whether you're trying to just understand some of the relations between nations. But why is it important, and how does one get a head start in maybe not necessarily having to go into an academic study of geopolitics, but at least in getting that push towards thinking geopolitically?
I think the easiest way is through the academic world. My colleague Albert Chapman and I wrote an essay for undergraduates and students who would be graduate students called So You Want to Study Geopolitics, in which we try to lay out how to go about studying geopolitics at an institution, at an academic institution that might not have courses in geopolitics or even a major in geopolitics. So we've attempted to create a series of guideposts for students in that setting on the web at the mackinderforum.org. On the other hand, if you're wanting to learn more about geopolitics and do it in a relatively non-academic way, there are authors who are of genuine utility I would recommend to begin with Robert Kaplan's work. Robert Kaplan is a geopolitically informed author who's traveled the world, and he's reported on what he's seen that has geopolitical relevance. His book, Bulk and Ghosts, is regarded as a classic, but he's written, I would guess, another 10 or 11 books, all of which are about different regions of the world and document what he's seen and his reflections on the geopolitics of different locations in different regions. I might also urge people, undergraduates again, who might want to learn something about geopolitics, but not necessarily in an academic setting, to read certain science fiction writers. Frank Herbert comes to mind. His book, Dune, and the sequels are informed by geopolitics. Frank Herbert's book, Dune, reads like a futuristic version of Ibn Khaldun, which is one of the classics of geopolitics, one of the classic authors of geopolitical thinking. So there are a number of different ways to approach the study of geopolitics without necessarily being in academia. I would also urge anyone who is interested in geopolitics to read widely. Read postings by different scholars and journalists on a wide variety of think tank web pages. We have a list of those also at the mckinderforum.org. Stratfor is certainly a place to begin. Gatestone Institute, Heritage Foundation, Hudson Institute. Many of these places post assessments that are geopolitically informed. I would say that any corporate executive who is involved in international commerce or international investment nowadays needs to be informed about political risk. And I've posted with my co-author, Michael Hochberg, an essay on political risk and international corporations through Real Clear Defense, which lays out some of the reasons for taking geopolitics into account when engaging in an assessment of political risk. That is just one arena, perhaps an important arena, in which geopolitics can, in fact, inform decision-making.
Well, Len, I know we're pushing to the end of our time here. I definitely second your assertion on reading widely, and I'd throw in read as much foreign literature as you can as well. It's part of understanding the way different ways of thinking and approaching concepts and ideas. And I think that that's an important piece of geopolitics, is not necessarily trying to apply a unifying theory to the world and that everything works one way, but actually recognizing that the interaction of people and place over time has created different ways of perceiving and seeing and understanding. And the more we can be sensitive to those different ways, the more we can better understand what's driving potential competitors or partners in other parts of the world.
I think that the classic written by Sun Tzu in China, The Art of War, lays out a justification for not only understanding your own values and interests and fears, but also laying out a justification for understanding those factors as they manifest themselves in your adversaries. And by gaining a better sense of how interests, fears, and values manifest themselves abroad, you can be a more effective negotiator, a more effective military analyst, a more effective geopolitical thinker.
We're going to have to stop it here, but thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you for the interview. Thank you for the opportunity.
Len Hochberg is a senior fellow at FPRI and the U.S. coordinator for the Mackinder Forum. Stay up to date on the latest geopolitical developments. Sign up for our free newsletter. Visit worldview.stratfor.com. That's worldview.stratfor.com. I'm Roger Baker, and thank you for listening.